But I'm typing. I'm getting more stiff in my fingers, specifically my top knuckle, and knowing. And he knows how I eat, and he suggested the blood type diet. So, give me your input.
You're never pass on the wine.
It's about making an informed decision, right?
So here's my hang up on the blood type diet, is that we look at blood grouping, the ABO blood grouping, and if you really dig into the literature on this, that is one type of blood grouping. So there's, I think it's 30 plus different ways of grouping blood types. And so it's not to say that the ABO doesn't have some validity, but it is definitely more complex than that. And so if you follow, let's say you're type A and you follow that and you miss the mark, and it could be because of all those other blood types that we never talk about. All we ever talk about is ABO. But if you really, for the people that really live in that world and delve into it, it's way more complex than that.
Well, I have made some changes and I have noticed some difference. So, but you know, I don't know that it's that end and be all.
Wine's the solution, right?
Wine is the solution, but wine's the solution for everything. Especially when you're going through Snowmageddon and no power for 7 days. Okay, question. At 22 comments. Yes, sir.
I had a question for Dr. Longleaf and Dr. Menza. Have you noticed any differences between plant community types when it comes to the secondary plant compounds? Like you're looking at total mixed ration versus Bermuda, but I was wondering if there would be a difference between, say, a diverse cover crop, where you have an annual-based system versus, say, a climax community, or depending on the area, maybe a grassland or savanna.
We haven't looked at it as deep as what you described in details, but speaking of it broader, is that we typically see that with increased biodiversity, whether it be cover crops or just like a diverse mountain pasture, those seem to result in a phytochemically rich piece of meat. So my idea about this is that these details matter, but they don't matter as much probably as if you're able to increase the biodiversity on your pasture, whether it be cover crops or any other way that you would achieve that. I think that would be a good thing. And I'm sure there will be some subtle differences. We see some subtle differences, of course, based on what the NOA, but typically, just broadly speaking, if you have good biodiversity, plant diversity, you're going to end up with a phytochemically rich piece of meat. So, and I think what's most important is the local solutions. Do what works for you on your farm. You're able to implement these steps. And I think that's my view on it, but perhaps Fred can speak to it too.
Yeah, I sure agree with what Stefan was saying there. It is going to depend really on the local environment and the mix of plants you have. It makes sense to me that the more you can increase diversity, the more you increase the overall health of your ranch, not only for the domestic animals, but for all the other kinds of creatures that live there. I'd also say too, I was emphasizing, eating diets that might have 25, 50, 75 plants, but there's some really neat studies that are coming out of New Zealand that going simply from a monoculture like alfalfa or ryegrass to increasing 3 to 5 more species. And there's a bit of strategy here in which species get increased in terms of their secondary compounds, tannins, and terpenes and so forth, but it can have really big benefits for animals. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, if you've got a monoculture, that, well, I need somehow to quickly get 50 or 60 species out there. I think even 3 to 5 can make a big difference in terms of the health of the animals, and then as Stefan's been showing in terms of what's going to get into milk and meat and so forth.
Just to add to that too, I think there's a lot in diversity of age, diversity of, we're talking planting. I was really interested to hear a discussion recently about doing tests on forage utilization. So, this whole argument about how much is the right depth of grass, how much material should you be taking off. And in multi-species cover crops, you'll end up with a situation where it's an experiment. Everything's planted at the same time, and you get a percentage takeoff much closer to a 30 or 40 or 50% because all the animals are the same age, all the plants are the same age. Whereas you go into a pasture, natural pasture, prairie environment, there's huge diversity. Some old plants, the grass that's 40, 50, 60-year-old is maybe more palatable or less palatable depending on the situation. So diversity is not just a species thing. We tend to get stuck on this. A deep-rooted perennial versus a new one versus one that's just germinated, it all throws this complexity into the picture that we tend to forget about in this nutrient discussion. It's there, it's real.
If I could ask a question, for those people, for those of us that have a Bermuda type or a Bahia pasture, and we've heard a lot how plant diversity is important for all the components that we've heard. How do we do that?
Yeah.
I mean, we've heard a lot about cover crops, and a lot of people telling that cover crops is the solution. So I'm going to pick on Betsy and Wayne.
I think you can have a lot of diversity in Bermuda. One doesn't preclude the other. You can drive it to a monoculture, but Bermuda is out there. Coastal Bermuda is out there. Tip and jigs, all those things in Texas. And you can't just all of a sudden wipe all that out, but you can slowly change it so that you have more fungal, it becomes more fungal, and you have more fir grasses, that's what you want to do. Or you can use more trace minerals that we were talking about missing so much. You can make a good feed out of most any grass. Now you'll notice today they didn't eat what they ate overnight out in those pastures. They didn't eat those low-level grasses at all. The Bahia and a lot of that. They went back to the fresh stuff that they needed some protein. It's because there's not any protein in that old stuff. They're seasoning season. So you got to kind of go with the flow and quit obsessing about every little weed that comes up because it's just trying to help you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's my take on it.
This is more of an observation because I come at it from a wildflower herding point of view. But I know something about the history of the way the land was used in this area, which blows my mind. But what I'm seeing in this property here, I was amazed the first time I came out here at the diversity of what I call wildflowers that are on the property, and she hasn't been here that long. So that means that those seeds were available and they were allowed to come up and sprout. So the natural diversity for this area is coming in. And if we're going to respect what happens in our areas, we need to be aware of that. Now, just how much as the soil changes and as the microbiome is increased, it'd be interesting to see just where that progression goes. But I'm kind of like with you, don't worry about that weed. It's simply a plant you didn't recognize. And if it has value, fine.
It wouldn't be there if it didn't have value.
Right.
Mama Nature's not going to waste energy on bringing up something just so Monsanto can kill it.
To add to Betsy's comments about, how do you get from where you are to somewhere else? I would say from my perspective, from the grazing management perspective, you've got the variables. You've got what's the depth of graze, that's going to influence what comes out. What's the time period, and what's the density around it. And depending on how you can push that and how you want to push that, you could get rid of the Bermuda or you could encourage it. Those variables are your least cost variables. You can bring in things. Betsy knows a lot more about bringing in microorganisms at the right time, but those microorganisms need feeding and they need reinforcement. So what I'm talking about animal-wise and what she's talking about is creating the right growing conditions. One might be a little bit slower, one might be a little bit faster, but they're all interacting and they're all creating the food, the home, the aeration. All of these things are so critically important. So it's these variables and how we interplay and monitor and work towards the outcome.
I have a question. So we do have some here. So we're looking into purchasing a no-till drill. So that's our way of kind of getting the Bermuda/Bahia issue under control because it is invasive and it takes over everything. What's y'all's view on cover cropping through that type of use, not really actually disturbing the soil versus, tilling it up and breaking it, which we won't do. So what's y'all's view on a no-till drill type situation?
I need you to get closer and repeat that question.
There are ways to ask.
If you want me to.
So no-till drill. So
A
that's
drill drill.
okay. So this is our solution for going through like Bahia, Bermuda type grass and being able to get those cover crops in the ground because Bahia is very invasive and it's hard to get them to germinate, especially in like a standing loam type situation. So what have you seen as far as anybody using that type of a system?
Well, I think you can no-till nearly anything if you put enough weight on it. And if you select something that has a small seed that doesn't need to be completely covered, visible to no-till, of course. And the season you're doing it. But you've got to set it up to be as much like nature performs as we can. And Bill Neiman tells me the number one thing people make a mistake in planning, even with no-till, is the depth. You can get it too deep, and you're just
destroying everything.
yeah, right. I don't know if that answers your question, but you can move past those things by improving the overall health and by putting the microbes back in and working. But you've got to match in your package is fungal to bacterial ratio of you're trying to match to what you're trying to grow. So what you find where you are is where you have to start, and you go from there. If I see the prairie grasses, if the hardhead being eaten out by every old long-eared cow in the county, I'm going to presume there is enough organic matter and enough seeds restored in the soil that I can start with a 1-to-1 fungal bacteria. And so I'm going to set that up, and I'm going to make my mineral mix based on that too, where I want to go. So it takes some planning and it takes some time, but it will slowly change.
We're getting native seeds that haven't been on the property in years.
What?
The native seed thing is actually coming back. So it's actually
It's there. I don't know where they got this was not there. I mean, we see new plants every year come in, and it's like,
It's fantastic.
It's there.
my dear, where have you been?
Are you familiar with Dave Brown? He has a book, like as a good kind of starter for what you're talking about. Dirt to Soil. He's in North Dakota.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So I
The
think
title again is not there.
I think I can find it.
So I got a slightly different perspective again. It's for me, it's creating the right growing conditions, similar, but a lot of time you put out seed and nothing happens. A lot of the trials that we've run with a number of producers in Texas with multi-species into a pasture, very often nothing's going on. And for me, it's not about anything other than the soil growing conditions for the cover crop are not there. So an alternative to that is trying out what is density do and what is recovery time. And we're calling them safe to fail trials. So you put in really high density and then see what the variable of time does. Linda here has done some trials up in Kansas with unbelievable results. So ultra high density, looking at what's too much density, and having this massive shift in species. Jonathan there started with cover crops from an ag base, has left the new seed thing, but is just building density on top of that. You've got to create the growing conditions. And trying to get this balance between what's the right density and the right animal performance, so it's this incremental build-up. But a lot of the seeds that we really want, or the plants we really want, will germinate when the growing conditions are correct, when the seed is in the right place. As Betsy says, nothing's there for, it's nothing bad, it's the expression of what the conditions are that's creating the growing conditions for that plant to thrive. Incrementally improving the ecosystem, the soil quality, the soil growing conditions will create that right condition. How much of a hurry are you in? And how can you push it? And what can you learn with little experiments that are going to help you learn without paying dearly for it? That's the game to play. So,
Fred, did you have something you wanted to add, Fred?
I really agree with what's being said there in terms of creating the growing conditions. I haven't worked with Bahia, but so I'm trying to think about where I did work. And there's a plant species called crested wheatgrass that was introduced from Eurasia into the Great Basin on many areas as a spring forage. And that was done in the 50s. It's an incredibly competitive grass. It's hard to get rid of once it's seeded into monocultures. But we did a lot of work over the years with grazing and management of grazing and rotation to try to increase the diversity. And what we realized is that there was this seed bank still of all these native plant species, grasses and forbs, that was still there. But what we had to do through time and timing was to put pressure on crested wheatgrass. So we would graze that plant at a time that we knew it was most vulnerable, to try to decrease its competitive ability and to try to release those other plant species. So I think time and timing of grazing and how you rotate is very important. There was also a plant called sagebrush that's really common in this part of the world that through improper spring grazing, it takes over and becomes a monoculture. Through winter grazing and through fire, we were able to very quickly increase the abundance of all these perennial grasses and forbs and shrubs and reduce the abundance of sagebrush. So I think what I'm saying is how do you create the conditions that allow these other species to go? And those are some of the experiences that come to my mind relative to the conversation.
Thank you, gentlemen, and Ms. Betsy. Appreciate it.
I was just going to add, not to be afraid of disturbance. I think we tend to feel the pendulums as humans, and one pendulum that I saw, the no-till, no disturbance movement was don't disturb it at all, don't cause any stress at all. And we see in nature, if we had 1 million bison run over the Blackline Prairie after the rain, I guarantee you it was disturbance. And that happens, and you see great results from that, but you have to know the proper rest after, know the context that you're in. But don't be totally afraid of, again, fitting into just a box and saying, we've got to not disturb. There's disturbance in nature, and sometimes good things happen because it's resilient. And a lot of those native seeds are waiting for some type of disturbance, whether it be a hard freeze, which I think really helped this year in Central Texas, because we hadn't had hard freeze in 30, 40 years, and we finally did, and we're seeing natives pop where we haven't seen in a generation.
Sorry.
I'm gonna break a promise that I made to myself, so I'm gonna say something. I'm not a scientist at all, but I have been practicing control grazing, whatever you want to call it, for a long period of time. And not one time today did I hear anything, you talk about the land, but you don't break it up and identify different pieces of it. I learned the difference some reason, like I said, I'm not a scientist, I don't have the answer, but once I moved to the place to where I had 30 plus paddocks per herd, and actually what that meant was I had about 45 paddocks with one herd. Put everything together, make it simple. Those paddocks were permanent paddocks. And it's a pet peeve of mine that I don't know how to get past with a lot of people, but I see people that use a lot of temporary fence. I was in Oklahoma last week with a guy, a rancher, and he moved his cows into a paddock of pasture. And it was obvious that it was should have been 4 or 5 paddocks. But he said, well, it's dry, you know, I don't really need to break it up. It broke that deal of not having enough paddocks. And when you get up to the high paddock number, things start to change. One of the things that changed for me, y'all talk about the hay grass or what to plant and all of this. The truth is, you want to capture as much rain as falls down. You want to capture every last drop you can. You got to have a turf over it to do that. You got to use what you've got. So make it as good as you can. You know, within 2 years, our bahia grass, we don't like bahia grass because it seeds up before it makes any leaves. Within 2 years, we have bahia grass that doesn't produce hardly any seeds at all. You know, I had a guy accuse me 30 years ago of planting some other kind of bahia grass. I didn't know what he was talking about. I was naive. I was just trying to make a profit on my cows. And there's been this whole, I don't know what it's called, but this movement with all this stuff where everybody wants to break it into all these pieces. And what are the right pieces I need to put together? And Betsy's the one that described it today. All of that stuff is a storm in a teacup. It's all stuff you can use. If you lay the basic groundwork down, most of the stuff is going to take care of itself. You know, we got to where this is the promise I'm breaking. I'm not here to discuss what I did, any of that. But that same grass, as I look out the window here, no offense to you at all this grass is what I grew. I was educated, but I would call that phase 3 grass. It's got seed heads on it. So it doesn't have as much nutritional value. Where if you have these individual plots around, it's like the different animals in your herd that you get to know. Some of those paddocks are strong, some of them are weak. Some of them are better sometimes of the year than others. You learn to manage it through all of that. But in principle, you're trying to keep all the grass. So when the frost comes, you're talking about 2 to 4 weeks from now. If that was all in leaves, when the frost came, you got totally different feed out there. You talked about supplementing the cows. One of the things that we did was our cows went into the winter body condition score 7. So that they could lose 2 body condition scores. Calf is 5 and still breed back with no supplementation, no hay. And we started with moving the hair grass. Betsy was there, she's seen it. I mean, there were native grasses that I don't have a background in that, but I mean, we had eastern ground grass. The only thing that never showed up was switchgrass. So, but a lot of forbs. So I just want to encourage y'all because it frustrates me. You're passionate, ignited me, okay? That's what I'm here for. I used to have it. I like BPO.
Well, I think it's really interesting though, what you're saying overlaps what you said, and your passion. Because it's not about the specific diet. It's about, that bigger overall thing of going for the diversity and the health and all the
It's
things.
just so many people are looking for so many pieces
Yeah.
instead of just backing off and looking at the view
Yeah.
and saying, how can I make this
to the point of both you, I'd make a comment that we have predominantly the hay grasses. So in trying to learn how to work with that grass, I did a lot of research trying to understand it. I listened to what professional outlets I could listen to try to glean insight. And this year when we got all the rains back in the spring, it just really threw everything into a tailspin because the grass grew so fast that it grew out from under me. I couldn't move the cows fast enough to keep up with it. And so literally, I just stopped and cut the whole farm back. And cut the whole farm back and said, you know what? I'm just gonna watch the animals and let them tell me what to do and where to go. And in a week and a half, I had my herd back. And it broke all the rules that everybody has around managing behavior. But I watched the animals and listened to them.
I think it was more thinking about what you were talking about human health and like, you know, we all go after like, what diet should I follow? And what, you know, we micromanage even our nutritional inputs and, you know, all the things. And here we are trying to micromanage and we just need to pull back, you know, hey, what? Let nature be that guide.
One comment I can make to that sort of thing is we work on things out of order, trophic level wise, often. And once we start doing that, then we mess up kind of the foundation of just letting it be pasture, which is what I'm talking about. And let me make sure that we get those basic photosynthesis, give an opportunity, get the biology back in the grass, let it come up what wants to come up, plant something, but let anyone who comes in, meaning plant, that wants to help, come on in. You get that going, then you're building up biomass, you're building up organic matter, you're using your sun power, you're not. We feed no hay anymore unless it's for the sugar factor when it gets real cold, sort of thing. We do not put out mineral blocks or mineral tubs anymore because our grass is just high enough that we don't need to do that. That's a tremendous saving when you don't get on that old tractor in the wintertime and haul hay out there that usually hasn't been put up right and it doesn't have the nutritional value. So there are a lot, it depends upon where you are, but you have to let things just come and just go and keep observing, keep monitoring. I like to do that. Everyone else may not like to. But if you're out there in the pastures, you're going to figure out a lot of things. But just because this weed comes up, they say, tell me when I go up there, I don't want that weed anymore. That weed. Well, if you don't have that weed, then you're not going to get these 10 things, good things over here. It's a community. Nothing stands alone. Monoculture is bad for business. No matter where you are and what kind of business you're in. I don't know. That's how I do it.
I have a question, Betsy, on that. I've been trying to develop pastures for years. I haven't done very well at it. But right now I'm having a large number of deep taproot things like oakweed, pigweed, camphorweed, even sunflowers that'll have a good taproot on them. Should I be trying to get rid of those things, or should I just accept the fact that they're here, they were here before I was, and I haven't managed to get rid of them in 25 years, but they're propagating to the point where shouldn't I be in there with a machete trying to get rid of these darn things, rather than allowing everything to grow?
Well, I kind of think we've got to see, this is a symptom. What is the cause that's having that? Why are we stuck at that level? But there is nothing finer than a tall sunflower.
Yeah.
And some of the amaranths or the pigweed and all of that are good. But you're going to find them in pigweed and all of that where somebody made a serious happening to that plot of land. You know, the old hog pens, the feed pens, all of those, your wheel where you put all the sheep when you brought them up, or the cattle, all of that sort of thing. You're creating that environment that can grow in.
Yeah, I'm in a situation where this was a woods area with a 30-story, a 30-foot understory of yopon, but I've gone there and cut all the yopon out. And the minute the light hits the ground, I got all this pokeweed coming up, and it's just thick enough that you can't walk through it.
Well, pokeweed's at least a native, and your
Yeah.
yopon might be too. Yopon is, what its main job is to bring up oodles and oodles and oodles of manganese. It's screaming to you, I need manganese, bring me manganese. And just like blackbirds are saying, I need cobalt, I need molly B. If I don't want to see that there, then I have to go out and get that working in a way that the plants can use it to help them come. It is what I'm trying to do. But have you all ever, their database is all over for weeds, but our database shows what the give back to the land is when it's senescent, not what it is, and that's what puts all the minerals from the ground back in. So I would let those things not go to seed, but get in the dough, and then cut them if you don't want them. It might help some, just to take some pressure off. But that's kind of the way I look at it. So.
See, I don't recognize what the weeds are, except
Right.
sunflower. So, but it's a symptom of what's happened. When you have massive change, which it sounds like you've induced, you're going to get a massive response. Whatever that is, it's a new situation. It's a new, and that's part of the new development. Right. Agree.
And what the sunflower is doing is pulling out magnesium and sulfur. And it is a fantastic pollinator. It will support, according to Dr. Tyler, it will support 83 to 85 different species of pollinators. That's huge. We could all starve to death if we keep killing these pollinators and by taking their food away because we don't like the way it looks. It's messy. Everything is messy in life, really, when you get down to it. Fixing a meal's messy. Just hate to get my hands all slimy and stuff. But you have to do that. Sorry.
Thank you.
I think you also need to know something about the plants that grow in the various areas of Texas and the surrounding states. Like Longleaf Pine is a Gulf Coast plant. Oh, it should be all the way from Florida, I think as far as at least Corpus Christi. And we don't have very many stands of Longleaf Pine left. Yopon is characteristic of the Big Thicket area. And the Big Thicket actually is, historically, was something like 1 million acres. It's now subdivided into those small units around Woodville and places like that. But what you're talking about is soils and climate that favor yopon, iron crossweed, and some of that actually goes as far as Buffalo Bayou in Houston. So you're dealing with, like she says, there's something in the soil that's causing this, but you're also dealing with what is native to this area. And it's helpful to know what's native to this area. With climate change, we're going to see a shift in what is here, and make no mistake about it, there will be a shift.
Thank you.
I don't know if that helps.
Brandon, can you tell people, like she's saying, you need to know what's native. Like, where can people go look to find out what is native, what you should grow in their area?
So the NRCS has a free resource database that anybody can access. It's Web Soil Survey. You can go in and draw your property off in that database, and you can pull the soil series for your property on that database. And with it will come the ecological site descriptions, which will reference the plant communities she's talking about. And that's all linked to another website where they keep a database of all these native plant communities, what this would have looked like if we could get in a time machine and go back 400 years, at least what we think it would look like. Obviously, that's not a real thing, but it at least gives us a starting point or a goal to pursue if that's your objective, to reach climax plant community.
What's the name of the database again?
The web soil survey will get you there, but the name of the database for the ecological sites is called EDIT. If you want to Google that with ecological site descriptions attached, you can pull your site-specific ecological sites.
Yes, NRCS.
NRCS.
It used to be easier, now it's tough to get to all that. Little Davis in California had a real good truck, and before I drive up to a place, I would pull up that and say, oh, I'm looking, I should be seeing blue, I should be seeing this, I should be seeing that. So I drive up there and say, hey, looks like you're getting some of the native pastures back. I mean, it's kind of a cheat sheet. But it's very informative. If you're buying property, you need to look at those things, and because part of history will always repeat itself.
You can consult your local NRCS office. There's one in every county just about in the state of Texas. They'll know all about these ecological sites, climax vegetation, your soils, and it's a free service to you as a taxpayer. So consult their services.
I was just gonna ask, like, how, like where we're at right now, it's been, we're in Northern California, and one of the things that we're kind of struggling with is that logging in the area that we're at has been going on, heavily for the last 100 years. And, prior to the 70s, there wasn't any of the replanting and things like that in areas. And so a lot of our veg type is very aspect, anything that's baked in the south or the southwest and all that, it's just baked to death, and it's all turned into brush as opposed to some version of forest, with the exception of oaks are able to handle the really high heat and the dryness. But one of the things that, like, we talked to the Cal Fire, they're kind of the forested experts, and then we talked to different biologists, and then we talked to NRCS folks. And everybody's view of sort of like what it should be or what it used to be is, it's sort of, if you step back and you look at it, you say, it kind of doesn't hold water, I mean, some of it does, but some of it doesn't. And like the suggestions now are, we have a lot of pine, ponderosa pine. And we have, a couple thousand acres of ponderosa pine plantation. They're 100 years old, they're this big around, and they're not 45, 50 feet apart like the suggestions now that, they're dying from drought and beetle and this and that because they're too close together. But yet, there's property all around us that hasn't been logged, and there's nothing that matches what our target should be. And so how do you find that voice of reason, like you talk about, that kind of cuts out some of the BS of like, this science-based thing that tries to answer how things are or should be based on science, as opposed to, kind of the bigger, ecological picture. How do you weed through some of that stuff? Because I want to use the resources that you guys have, and I want to use the resources that Cal Fire and that, the game and fish and all that, but it doesn't, like, when I listen to that, it just doesn't ring true to me. It doesn't seem like that should be my picture of my future ideal for this landscape. And it's, it seems, it adds more questions than answers is really kind of where I'm getting to. And how can you filter through that stuff?
Is there historical information? Is there historical accounts of what it looked like? And I was fascinated to read some accounts of original settlers in the North Texas area and what was there. And that's fascinating in terms of how dense was grass, how diverse. It's not conclusive in terms of species, but at least it gives a view of what the ecosystem is like.
Yeah.
And I've used a lot of that in Southern Africa. Those early explorers, what was the availability of water? What was the impact of those big migrating herds? And it was massive. And so what kind of densities can you use? It does give a picture of what it must have looked like.
Yeah.
But it tells you
not a
what-
lot else we've got though.
But it tells you what it was. And what you just said is really valuable, but I want to, like, what you just said with climate change, I'm looking at going, it's changing. Like, what it was is not where it's going. And we hope to preserve it and bring it back and hold the water, whatever. But the reality is our pines are just dying. There's no water, but the oaks are thriving. And we can help bring some of the pine back and the diversity back, but it may just be that pine is not going to thrive there anymore. It may be a different climate, water situation.
And on top of that, it's like, we've heard some of those historical things that I don't recall now, whether it was like during the 30s or the 40s. There was, they said there was grasses this tall. They pushed, 6,000 sheep through the valley that we were at, and it didn't even last a decade, and it was just like, it was bare dirt. And so the sheep moved out and the cattle moved in, and since it's open range, we have little teeny tiny pockets that are in the most sheltered north-facing covered that we have, some grasses. They're still sort of thin, but a vast majority of our property, and you guys are talking about like how do you get rid of this grass or how do you get rid of, we just want any blade of grass, I mean, it's like bare dirt, you've got a piece of bunch grass here, and it'll be a foot or two before you have another little barely alive, piece of bunch grass. So we have a different challenge ahead of us. It's like, how do we even get the beginning of a foothold of anything to cover the soil, not just change the succession from one variety to many, and it's a different challenge. I mean, we like listening and learning from what where these other kinds of challenges, but for us, it's water. We just need to try to figure out how to slow the water, and get that effective rainfall. And part of the problem is like we don't even have enough grass there to get to get cattle at least, and we're looking at goats because we have lots and lots of brush, and we're hoping that even that animal impact component might get enough light and things to the soil that those native grasses will come back. But it's a different challenge.
Keep us posted on how it goes.
We will.
All right, one last question over here.
Yeah, I was just curious on meat flavor, if there's any strategies, because I know you're talking a lot about all the different plants, and each plant is gonna give a different flavor to the meat. So is there strategies on how to get a good flavorful product at the end? I think whoever wants to.
Fred, did you get the question?
I didn't hear the question very well. Can you tell me again?
Yeah, just on the meat quality, is there a strategy or a way to end up with good tasting meat on the diversity of plants?
Did you hear that? Sure.
Yes, so try. They're mixing plastic for that.
Are you back? Sorry, you.
Can you hear me?
Okay, now, yes, the connection was unstable.
Okay. I was just trying to make sure that I did understand the question and repeating it and saying, is it the idea of can you create certain mix of plants that then yields a certain flavor of animal? Was that the essence of the idea?
Yeah, basically, and because you've been talking everybody's been talking about the diversity, and so the different plants create different compounds, which are going to create different flavors. But how do we end up with a product that is enjoyable?
Yes, I think that gets to the experimental part of things in terms of trying things in the terroir. When I was in France 10 years ago, visiting with the shepherds and going to the different places and sampling the different cheese and meat that they produce. It was really unique to each place. Each producer would have a terroir to their place that was unique to the different mixtures of plants. And the people in the local communities had really come to appreciate that. So they didn't see it as something that was disflavorful or anything else. They just realized that Michel's cheese from Michel's is going to be different from cheese from Gascon and so forth and so on. And their palates would get really linked with that, and it became something of pride and of marketing, and they were all doing well. It wasn't that they were trying to compete with one another, but there were distinct flavors that came from those different landscapes. Makes me think what we were talking about seasonally as well. Arlen was making the point of eating seasonally and different things come and go. When I was in Utah, I used to love to hunt bluegrass, and I think of them a lot. Early in the fall, they had a really distinct, wonderful flavor. Late in the fall, when they moved into the Douglas fir trees and started to eat those needles, their flavor changed. Now they had a little hint of terpene. That was because Douglas fir was becoming a major concord. It wasn't that either one or the other was bad. It was simply reflecting their change in diet seasonally, and then, as that gets linked to the landscape that they were in.
Could I add something to that? If you're raising breastfed beef and trying to sell it, and you put them on what they call mustard cabbage, mustard weed, you're not going to be able to sell that. Because that flavor definitely comes through. The salt flavor, all of that. So what you have to do if you haven't got figured out a way to improve the health of the soil enough to get rid of this, so that you go past that mustard, then you better move your upcoming ones you're going to harvest into pastures that don't have that. So you better know your packets and what's happening. But you can just have a real disaster.
You never did that, right?
That makes me think, that's your comment, when I was in Ireland a few years ago, and they're telling the story of an old lady long dead, and she knew her pastures, she knew her different pastures, and when she really wanted to impress somebody that was coming, she made sure that the milk cows were on a particular pasture, because that was going to produce the most flavorful milk to impress the people, the guests that she was after. So she understood what you were talking. Different pastures produce different flavors in the milk in this particular case here, or the cheese if she chose to make cheese.
Yeah, we had milk cows, milk from cows that had eaten aloe. Not good. Aloe vera, aloe.
Well, thank you, presenters. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm honored to host you. We plan to have a few more events like this, so if you want to get information, sign up on the email. Drive home safely. And if you have any questions after the fact, you go home and you've got, I need to find out, I'm happy to share the contact information. So